"I'm not going to pull any punches," said Albert Teasdale, chairman of the Symphony Board of Trustees. He ran the flat of his hand over the top of his bald head, as if to sweep away any lack of resolve. "This is our last chance. If we don't pull a rabbit out of the hat, we fold up the trombones and go home." The reason for his pessimism was clear to every member of the board. They had had the bad news before them. In a report, subscription ticket sales down 15%, and down for the 7th straight year. Overall revenues down 12%, also for the 7th straight year. The fine arts funding, a critical resource, down 20%. That was a new one. And a real knife in the back. Overall operating deficit of $1.8 million. The endowment was down to $22 million, and it was shrinking faster than wet cotton pants in Death Valley. George Thomas, a lawyer, muttered to Alan Freeze, insurance, "I think we need more than a rabbit. We need Jesus and some wine." Albert Teasdale introduced Ellen Swisher-Sweet, the Symphony's new director of marketing. Ms. Swisher-Sweet, the only person in the room under the age of 60, she was 37, was also the only person in the room with a smile on her face as she began to speak. The board members looked as if they were attending a funeral. They didn't need to read the report to know how bad things were. Ms. Swisher-Sweet was the 4th new director of marketing they'd had in 5 years, so they'd seen that smile, that hope, that bubbly optimism before, and all those previous bubbles had burst. Ms. Swisher-Sweet, who spoke with a great deal of enthusiasm, announced plans to rejuvenate the audience of the Symphony. "We've got to reach out to the younger crowd, the people who maybe have never been to a classical concert in their lives," she said. "They might be a little intimidated, but it's our job, my job, to find a way to make them feel welcome. Some people, you know, when they think of the Symphony, they think it's, well, pretty stuffy." Miss Swisher-Sweet smiled apologetically, as if that was a terrible misconception, although she knew, after 3 weeks on the job, that the Symphony was stuffy. It was stuffier than a closet in the attic that hadn't been opened in 50 years. It was a mausoleum stuffy, and proud of it, that kind of stuffy. Stuffiness was about all it had left. There would be stars, too, she said, with international reputations, and the board members nodded their heads. Stars were wonderful, and bringing them here was a feather in the cap of the city, and it was thrilling to nosh with them at private parties, but those international reputations cost a fortune, and though the stars got tons of publicity, they never seemed to draw enough to pay for their own appearance. Miss Swisher-Sweet talked on about plans for children's concerts on the weekends, what she called casual concerts, designed to attract people who don't own a tux and can't afford $50 for a good seat. There was some grumbling among the board members, but reluctant agreement that something had to be done, or the Symphony would be lost, and that would be an unacceptable tragedy for the city. The Symphony was a cultural pride of the town, one of the 5 oldest symphonies in the United States. Well, it was definitely one of the 10 oldest, and it was one of the finest too, not in the class of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or Philadelphia, but definitely in the top 10 or 15 or so. And Music Hall was as much an institution as the orchestra, built 163 years ago, the finest structure that old world German craftsmanship could erect, a symphony in stone. Unfortunately, maintaining the glory of the ancient building was another financial headache. Its restoration, the papers had called it a facelift, 16 years ago was still not paid off, and the restoration could already use a little restoring. And people who had paid $50 for a ticket often complained that the seats were uncomfortable and too close together. Yes, the hall was old and fading, the audience was old and fading, the music played was mostly old and fading. Miss Swisher-Sweet privately confessed to friends that she felt like an environmental specialist who had been hired to save the world's last white elephant. It's doubtful she could have done it, even with all her resourcefulness and pluck. She needed a stroke of good fortune, and though she got neither rabbit nor wine, she did find something that scattered stuffiness like a tornado. Success often comes by accident. This is a secret known to nearly all successful people. The trick is to recognize the accident and capitalize on it, not correct it. Miss Swisher Sweet's accidental salvation came about because Music Hall was being rented out for a number of events not related to the symphony. That practice had not originated with Miss Swisher Sweet. It had started nearly 10 years ago when the slide into catastrophe had become pronounced, when the precious endowment began to dwindle, when funds were desperately needed, and even a special symphony patron fundraiser failed for the first time in history to balance the books. So a number of non-classical performers were booked into the hall, taking advantage of not only its availability, but also its splendid architecture and first-rate acoustics. There were country and western bands at first, later even rock and roll, and on into heavy metal and stand-up comedians. Some of them blew enough to scorch the magnificent red velvet stage curtains. It seemed like blasphemy in a temple. Board members shivered, shook their heads, and contemplated the trade-off between a desecration of the cultural institution and the necessity for keeping it alive. Then, in Miss Swisher Sweet's initial season, a scheduling conflict occurred. The hall had been double booked, and on the night of the symphony's debut concert of the season, that was always a big event, a social highlight, even if only half the house was sold this year. It was still a night when the symphony loyalists, their number declining, broke out their finest clothes and family jewels and celebrated what was both the beginning of a new season and another link in the unbroken chain stretching far into the past, of culture, tradition, civility, the things that made life worth living. It was an annual pinnacle of stuffiness. When Miss Swisher Sweet informed Albert Teasdale that the hall had been booked for another event on that same night, Mr. Teasdale's reply was curt and to the point. "Cancel it," he said, and he hung up the phone, expecting to hear no more from the young lady. She was gung-ho, and he liked that, but he thought she couldn't have an iota of business sense in her head double-booking the house on the opening night. The error had in fact been made by Miss Swisher Sweet's predecessor, who actually did not have an iota of any kind in his head, but was the son of a member of the board. He was now a vice president of a real estate firm in town, a position where he could live comfortably, and his father could see that he did no damage. When Miss Swisher Sweet discovered his mistake, she was horrified, but when she saw the results of that blunder, she was positively stunned. After Albert Teasdale hung up on her, Miss Swisher Sweet slipped off her shoes, put on her sneakers, and strode across town to Mr. Teasdale's bank. She told his secretary that she had important business with him that would only take a moment. It was imperative that she see him, and she would wait until he was free. Then she sat down and began her vigil. An irritated Mr. Teasdale saw her within an hour. He did not like to be bothered by symphony business at the bank. "What is it?" he asked her, his voice implying that whatever it was, it had better be good. Miss Swisher Sweet told him about the double booking. Mr. Teasdale began to do a slow burn. How dumb could this young woman be? "I thought we discussed that," he said, wiping his head with one hand. "We did," said Miss Swisher Sweet, "but there's something you don't know. This other event is a sellout. The gross on the house is $26,000 more, approximately, than our opening night symphony receipts. I thought you might like to know that before I commence the refund procedure." She handed him a copy of the box office report so he could see the figures for himself. Mr. Teasdale studied the numbers and said, which is what he always said when he didn't know what to say. "I've got an idea," said Miss Swisher Sweet. "Let's hear it," said Mr. Teasdale. "The combined ticket sales oversold the house," said Miss Swisher Sweet. "But if they booked another night, the following night, they might well be able to sell another 2,000 seats. "Are you saying we should change our opening night to move it back?" said Mr. Teasdale. "No, sir, that's not what I'm saying," said Miss Swisher Sweet. "I'm saying we should let both events go on at the same time. A combined attraction. It's risky, but I think it will work. And the payoff could be tremendous." Miss Swisher Sweet was betting that Mr. Teasdale would not be able to ignore the word payoff, no matter what he thought of her idea. Mr. Teasdale pretended to think about it, although he couldn't come up with any options. "What's this other event, anyway?" he said. Miss Swisher-Sweet had been avoiding this question for as long as she could. "It's pro wrestling," she said. "What?" shouted the banker. "Absolutely out of the question." "Sir, if I may," said Mr. Swisher-Sweet. "No," shouted Mr. Teasdale, "that's enough." "You want me to refund the money?" said Miss Swisher-Sweet, purely to stall the man. The thought of losing all that money, already in hand, accomplished her purpose wonderfully. Mr. Teasdale, a banker, after all, was caught with his hands stuck to the top of his head, unable to sweep anything away. "Sir, I understand your objection, but there's a great deal of money involved here, sir, and if I do say so, I think I could sell the hell out of this if you'd give me a chance. This wrestling is quite a sensation and has a devoted following. To put it mildly, sir, those wrestling fans are crazy. High ticket prices do not seem to deter them." Mr. Teasdale put his face in his hands. "Classical music and pro wrestling," he said. "Those great big muscle-bound brutes in little bathing suits, throwing one another around." Miss Swisher-Sweet nodded her head. "It's enormously popular," she said. "A great attraction. The orchestra won't stand for it," he said. "They'll quit. They won't play." "Sir, I've thought about that, and in my opinion, you might have a problem with Maestro Budzin, but I think the orchestra will go along. I know all about the classical hang-up, serious music and all that, but at heart they're musicians, sir, and if you tell them to play, I think they'll play." Mr. Teasdale took a deep breath. "Dear Lord," he said, "I don't feel right about this. I'll be known as the man who destroyed the symphony." "You'll be known as the man who saved it, sir," said Miss Swisher-Sweet. "Desperate times call for desperate measures. I know how painful it must be for you, Mr. Teasdale. You let me handle it. I'll give you the biggest box office in the hall's history. 2 sold-out nights back to back." "If you're wrong about this, it'll cost you your job," said Mr. Teasdale. Miss Swisher-Sweet nodded her head and smiled brightly. "All right," said Mr. Teasdale, "go ahead. I don't know how I'm going to break this to my mother." Mr. Teasdale's mother was 91 years old and had attended every symphony opening night since she was a little girl. Maestro Budzin was out of town, as he nearly always was, somewhere in Europe, conducting an orchestra for some festival. He had a contract which demanded his presence only on concert nights and perhaps 2 days of rehearsal. The orchestra had no deep ties to him, and Miss Swisher-Sweet figured correctly that when he heard the news and blew his artistic fuse and refused to conduct an orchestra while groaning, sweating pigs threw each other around a ring, no one would miss him, and in the end the board would thank her for unloading his exorbitant salary as well as his ego. She contacted the PR director of the Universal Wrestling Body, the UWB, a man named Irving Derringer. She had no trouble selling him on the idea. He loved it, and he leaped at the chance to book another night. When she hung up with Mr. Derringer, she was wishing everyone was that easy to work with. His only drawbacks were that he talked so fast she could barely understand him, and he called her doll. But if she could sell out the house 2 nights running, she told herself, the man could call her baby cakes, for all she cared. She billed it as the Grand Slam, an unprecedented evening of the world's finest classical music and professional wrestling. The first night she announced as a sellout, a description that had double meaning for Mr. Teasdale, who still hadn't told his mother. Prices for the remaining seats were raised to a premium, and they still sold out in record time. Some lifelong Symphony subscribers, shocked by what they considered the sideshow nature of the event, returned their tickets, but they were immediately snapped up by people eager to see this unusual combination of class and crash. It was an incredible sight when the opening night arrived. There were actually scalpers on the steps of Music Hall hawking tickets for 3 and 4 times the face value. The crowd was a remarkable mix of culture mavens and wrestling fans. Some wore pearls, furs, and silk. Others wore grease paint, leather, and studs. Some carried programs. Others were waving signs that read, "Kill the Mother," and "Savagery Rules." Maestro Budzin, freshly returned from Europe, had indeed blown his artistic fuse and resigned his post as conductor and musical director of the symphony, calling it a joke. The orchestra had balked initially, but they finally signed on to play when the bonus was offered and the call for replacements was about to be made. David Morgan, the concertmaster, agreed to conduct, and most of the musicians were privately pleased to bid goodbye to Maestro Budzin, whose nickname among them had been Dopey, and not just because of his big ears. All of them looked forward to playing before a full house, something they'd never experienced. And the huge hall was truly packed. Standing room only tickets were sold until the fire marshal declared that not another person could enter the building, or he'd order it emptied. Just the sound of anticipation that ran like high voltage through the audience before the lights dimmed, and a great shout went up. Music Hall hadn't seen the likes of this in well over a century, perhaps never. This joint, as Mr. Derringer remarked to Ms. Swisher Sweet, is really jumping. The night, both nights, were a huge success. Even Mr. Teasdale's mother was on her feet several times to applaud the music and to scream epithets at the grapplers. Pads had been laid on the stage in front of the orchestra, and it was there the wrestlers struggled while the strings, brass, woodwinds, and timpani played. The evening opened with Mozart, the Divertimento No. 2 in D major, K-131. It accompanied a tag team match which featured Doom and Destruction, champions of the UWB, against the Drag Brothers, a pair of 340-pound twin albinos from San Francisco. The match ended in a double disqualification, the music a standing ovation. That selection was followed by Tchaikovsky's Suite in G major, Opus 61, Mozartiana. The wrestlers battling along with this piece were Sister Mary Delgado, the wrestling nun, and Estrogena, the queen of feminism. Their contest was at once epic and poignant, and when Estrogena broke out of Sister Mary's dreaded neck pinch, reversing into her hormone lock for the pin, just as the music concluded, the old hall shook with roars, whistles, and applause. After a brief intermission, it was time for the big tussle of the evening, a Texas death match featuring Jake the Dentist Walsh, the current UWB title holder, putting it all on the line against the number one contender, the Pig Impaler. They were locked into a cage, and they wrestled until only one man was left standing, while the orchestra played the Symphony Fantastique by Berlioz. Music Hall had never seen or heard a sight like this. The fight was fierce and bloody, and the music soared. At one time it appeared that both men had been knocked unconscious, but as the glorious music of Berlioz came to its magical end, the dentist pulled himself to his feet, gave the Pig Impaler one last zing with his drill, and staggered out of the cage to win and retain his belt. The success of the evening cannot be overstated. Reviewers who came prepared to heap scorn wrote glowing tributes to the lyric qualities of the wrestlers. Miss Swisher Sweet was given the raise she deserved, as well as the credit for rescuing a cultural institution and giving wrestling a good name. She began planning a partnership with the zoo, monkeys on flutes, the March of the Penguins, something extravagant with cats. Mr. Teasdale gained added stature in the city as a man unafraid to take a risk, a man who, dare we say it, vision. His mother can't wait for the next concert, which promises real fireworks with Stravinsky and Beethoven teamed up with the Living Dolls, Barbie and Strawberry Shortcake, taking on G.I. Joanne and the Librarian, the Atom Smasher versus the Human Silo, and a special rematch of the Dentist against the Pig Impaler. Since neither of them died as a result of the Texas death match, bringing them back by popular demand seemed like the right thing to do. Also, in a little human interest aside, Mr. Morgan, the new conductor, is dating Sister Mary Delgado.